When Amanda finally awoke, it was to terror coursing through her veins. She looked around in a panic as her final memory before being knocked out flooded her mind. Ragged breaths escaped from her, but they were muffled by a cloth gag, the noise mixed with the sound of rattling chains as she tried in vain to free herself from the stone slab she'd been lashed to, but to no avail. "Shoo, my dear," someone said from behind her. She angled her head back towards him, and was met by a figure dressed in a black cloak looming over her, a dagger held in his right hand. Her eyes widened when she saw the blade was already encrusted with dried blood. "Relax," the man reassured her. "It will all be over soon." He raised the dagger, poising the blade directly over her heart. A muffled scream of sheer panic escaped from Amanda, and she thrashed once more, desperately trying to break free of her restraints one final time. Then the knife came down, and she was cruelly silenced. God, what a shithole. The tall man adjusted his brown Stetson hat and took a drag on his cigarette before pulling the final stub from his mouth and throwing it on the ground, then grinding it beneath his boot, snuffing out what few embers remained. All around him, the city moved without a care, carriages and people hustling to and fro throughout the streets, nobody even glancing at him as he moved among them, out of place as he was. Alan shifted, adjusting the Ithaca double-barrel shotgun slung over his right shoulder. He'd almost expected more people to be concerned at the shotgun on his back and the single-action army revolver on his right hip, but nobody spared him any attention at all, busy as they were. That probably shouldn't have surprised him the way it did. San Francisco was a steel and concrete jungle, where the denizens dressed in well-pressed suits and dresses, and everyone seemed to have something important to rush to or fret over. It was a far cry from his jeans and plaid and frontiersman lifestyle, and yet he'd found himself here all the same, thanks to the work drying up. His brow furrowed at that thought. It seemed like wherever he went, there was less and less work for someone like him with every passing year. It was always the same. He'd settle in a new place for a bit, find some work as a rancher or a farmhand, and then, without fail, just a short time later, the farm would die or be bought out by some big company looking to turn a profit, and he'd be cut loose to find his own way yet again, with just his guns and the clothes on his back to keep him company. There were very few undiscovered places left to stake a claim in the United States these days, ever since the California Gold Rush and the end of the Civil War. He hadn't been alive to experience the gold rush, and he'd been too little to see much of the war, but they were still affecting him even decades after they'd both ended. He'd come to California in search of more work. He'd found it for a bit, but then his circumstances had changed, same as they always did, and he'd found himself heading north to try and start over yet again. With any luck, San Francisco would just be a stopping point. He'd only been off the train for a few minutes and he already hated the place. There were too many people here, all fretting over things that were almost certainly inconsequential. The streets were thick with crowds, everyone walking almost shoulder to shoulder with each other. It was so loud, too, always someone shouting or some machine going off in the distance, nothing like the quiet farms and frontiers he'd come to appreciate over time. Oh yeah, and the city smelled, too. Couldn't forget that. Alan let out a sigh and tipped his hat a bit to keep the sun out of his eyes as he walked. He reached into his pocket for another cigarette and lit it, then took a drag. He could already tell it was going to be a hell of a task, trying to find a place to pick up an odd job for a day or two. Land of opportunity, my ass. As expected, a few hours of searching had led to nothing fruitful. He'd come up completely empty in terms of employment prospects, which wasn't surprising in a place like this. People wanted something more permanent than what he had to offer. Nobody needed a day laborer for just a few days, or even a few weeks. He'd even inquired about that and still been turned down. No, they wanted someone willing to stay for months. Months. Weeks would be too long for him. And so, he'd resigned himself to getting some fresh air to try and clear his head while he took stock of the situation. Money was always tight, but he had enough on his person to last him a few days. And if he got truly desperate, he could always part with his Ithaca for a decent price that'd get him at least a week's worth of additional money. Not the Colt, though. He'd never part with the Colt. Anyone who wanted it would have to pry it from his corpse. Alan's most recent cigarette finally burned out. He pulled the stub from his mouth and reached for a new one, only to find that his pack was empty. He let out a frustrated sigh, then tossed the empty pack on the ground and continued on his way. Little money, no prospects, and now no cigarettes. Just his luck. A sign up ahead told him he was entering the city's harbor. Alan barely spared it a glance before continuing on anyway. He wasn't much one for water in his opinion. If man were meant to swim, God would have given them gills and fins, but it wasn't like he had anything else to do aside from explore. And besides, the harbor would hopefully have far fewer people milling about than the city streets did, even if it smelled like salt water and fish. It would have been a solid plan, were it not for the ship docking right at the moment he entered the harbor. A vein pulsed in his forehead as people began to disembark, pushing their way past him without a care in the world. They were all babbling in strange, accented languages he didn't recognize, though a few were speaking English, with varying degrees of fluency. Frustrated by the sudden flood of strange people, Alan turned and began to walk away when he heard a woman's voice call out to him. "You there, with the hat? I demand you come speak with me." Again, a vein pulsed in his forehead. Whoever this woman was, she clearly didn't understand a thing about minding her manners or not pissing off people armed with shotguns. Still, if she'd wanted to get his attention, she certainly had it now. He turned towards her and was about to give her a piece of his mind when he froze. The woman was approaching him, and he had to admit, he'd never seen someone who looked quite as exotic as her. She was clad in a fancy white dress that looked like it had come fresh from the Victorian era. Somehow, it was spotless despite the grime that covered the pier they were standing on. She was short, standing just over 5 feet, a far cry from his 6'4". Most striking of all was her appearance. However, she had eerily pale skin and short golden blonde hair that fell down to just past her ears, and her eyes were, against all odds, a very deep crimson. She was also carrying a small parasol to keep the sun off of her, though it seemed somewhat out of place on a day as overcast as this one. She looked absolutely otherworldly. He couldn't help but freeze at the sight of her. It was a wonder that the other people on the boat weren't staring at her the way he was, but then again, perhaps they'd simply had time to grow accustomed to her during their voyage. She stopped a short ways away, giving him a haughty look. After a moment, she sniffed. "You'll do, I suppose," she said. "I'll do?" Alan echoed. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I am new to this land. My servant and I require a guide." "Your servant?" Footsteps from behind him caught his attention, and Alan whipped around, one hand instinctively falling to his holstered Colt. His eyes widened when he saw the giant man who'd come up behind him so suddenly he was even taller than Alan was, standing about 6'7", with a tan complexion and dull green eyes. He carried himself very stiffly, and had an even expression on his face despite the fact that Alan's hand was on the butt of his revolver. The giant man was dressed in an immaculate black suit that somehow fit him perfectly, with a deep red undershirt and a red tie. About the only thing he had in common with Alan was his black hair. "Introduce us, would you?" the woman said dismissively. The tall man's mouth curled into what had to be a smile, though it looked utterly unnatural on him. "But of course, my lady." He cleared his throat. "Greetings, traveler. You have had the privilege to be directly addressed by Her Grace, the Queen-to-be Lady Sable. If only most mortal men would be so lucky." Alan was taken aback. He stared for a moment before clearing his throat. "And you are?" "I am A.Z., butler to Lady Sable." "Alan Smith," he offered, despite his reservations. His southern drawl sounded out of place compared to whatever exotic European accent these two had. "And what's this I hear about her being a queen-to-be?" "It's simple, really," Sable offered, coming up alongside him. She unfolded a small paper fan and began to softly wave it in front of her face, never once losing that stuck-up expression on her face. "I am to be the future queen. But until that day, I am simply a queen-to-be." "Queen of what?" "Everything. Again, Alan could only stare in surprise. Quite the lofty goal. Indeed. Most mortals would be satisfied with being the boss of their own company. I am not most mortals. Now then, when can you depart? Depart? Alan asked. What do you mean? The lady intends to hire you for your expertise when it comes to traversing the area, AZ interjected. Alan looked to him in surprise. After a moment, AZ said, we need you to direct us to the next town. Well, I'm sorry to say that you've got the wrong guy, Alan offered. I'm new to the area, myself. Just got off the train this morning. Train, Sable said, that same dismissive tone creeping into her voice. I do not trust them. Steel metal death traps controlled by fallible, mortal men. It's a big country, lady. Can't always travel by boat. I prefer flying, actually. That did it, these two were nuts. Well, however you prefer to get around is none of my business. I'll just be leaving now. Alan made it one step before Sable called out to him. Perhaps I can make it worth your while, she said. Alan stopped. Without looking back, he said, how much money are we talking? I do not deal in paper currency too easy to lose or damage. What I do deal with, however, is the currency of our forefathers' jewels, gold, silver favors. Jewels, gold, and silver are much more my speed, Alan told her, turning back around to face her. I'll ask again, how much are we talking? Sable snapped her fingers. AZ stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and offered it to Alan, who accepted it with confusion before opening it. His jaw dropped at what he saw. Is this real? He asked. You would doubt the authenticity of something from my family's personal collection? Sable demanded. No, that's a big diamond, lady. You can't blame a guy for wanting to make sure. Take that knife on your belt and try to scratch it. That will tell you if it's real or not. Alan did as he was told, drawing the massive hunting knife from the left side of his belt and gently scoring the steel blade against the top part of the jewel. To his amazement, it didn't leave a mark at all. Satisfied, he sheathed the blade, then closed the box and handed it back to the butler, who swiftly pocketed it. Let me just get this straight, he said slowly. You're willing to offer me that diamond for, what, taking you to the next town? Indeed, Sable confirmed. Seems a little too good to be true, don't you think? I am willing to pay handsomely for a man who carries himself the way you do. These other people walk and talk as if they have nary a clue how the real world works. You are not like that, however you walk like a man with purpose and confidence. That tells me that you are someone who can be trusted. If you say so, Alan replied. All right, get whatever it is you're going to need and follow me. We'll head out now, if that's all right with you. Sable nodded. She snapped her fingers again, and AZ bent down to grab a giant bag. Alan expected him to buckle under the weight of it, but he didn't seem to care, instead picking it up and slinging it over his shoulder as if it were filled with nothing but air. He couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at that, but ultimately said nothing, instead setting off at a brisk walk, Sable and AZ following behind him. These two were certainly strange, not to mention suspicious, but that diamond was tempting enough that he was willing to take a chance. And besides, as big and intimidating as AZ was, he didn't seem to have any weapons on him. The three of them started walking together, Alan still uncertain about where exactly he was supposed to be taking them. He was so lost in his own thoughts that he very nearly ran into someone as they rounded a corner. Sorry, Alan said, sidestepping the man just in time. Wasn't paying attention. It's quite all right, my boy, the man replied. In fact, I was just. The man suddenly trailed off, and at the same time, Alan became aware of the fact that Sable and AZ were no longer keeping pace with him. He turned around and saw that Sable and the strange man were staring at each other. For the first time, Alan was able to take in the man's appearance. He was a bit shorter than Alan, with a fading hairline and a large beard, and was dressed in some kind of military uniform, though it wasn't one that Alan recognized. He had a sword of some kind sheathed at his waist, but as strange as that was, it paled in comparison to his eyes, which were a striking red, similar to Sable's. Alan scarcely had time to dwell on the matter, however, before the strange man suddenly cleared his throat. "Ah, but where are my manners?" he said, taking Sable by the hand. "What is your name, my lady?" "Sable," she answered. "Sable," he repeated. He gave her hand a chaste kiss. "It is an honor to make your acquaintance, my lady." "And your two servants?" "Az," the giant man replied. Alan's brow furrowed. "I'm no servant." "Ah, a difficult one?" "Fret not, my lady, you will come around in due time," the strange man told her with a smirk. "Anyway, but I must be going now. It was good fortune that brought us together, friends, and I sincerely hope that we may all meet again under happy circumstances once more." "Yeah, okay," Alan deadpanned. "And who are you supposed to be, exactly?" "You may call me Norton," the man answered. "Not my full title, of course, but there will be time for such formalities later. For now, as I mentioned, I simply must be going. Safe travels." With that, Norton turned and left them, marching off down the street by himself. Alan watched him go for a moment, then let out a tired sigh. Wherever these people had come from, they were certainly out of touch and out of their element. It would pay for him to be on his toes around them for the duration of the job. Hopefully, it would be a short one. "Weird-ass town," he muttered as he began walking again. "So where exactly are you trying to go?" Alan asked. They had just left San Francisco, exiting through the main road. Alan had used some of his personal money to purchase a map of the area, which would hopefully be enough to get them to wherever it was Sable and Az wanted to end up. Sable shrugged. "The next town over. I have no preference." Alan's brow furrowed. "That's not really a help to me. I need to know exactly where I'm leading you if we're going to get there properly." "I just told you, it makes no difference. I do not know where anything is in this country. I simply need to keep moving." Sable and Az were already weird, but they just kept getting weirder with every statement. Alan found himself wishing for another pack of cigarettes. "My lady, if I may make a suggestion?" Az asked, coming up alongside them. "Perhaps a small town would be the best destination for us, given your stated goal." "And what goal would that be?" Alan asked. "Were you not listening when I said I wish to rule over everything?" Sable questioned. Silently, Alan amended his earlier wish for a pack of cigarettes to a carton of them instead. "But yes, a small town makes sense," Sable agreed with a nod. "How small are we talking?" Alan said, pulling out the map. "There's a town called Los Baños that's a few days away on foot. If we take a train." "No trains." Her aversion to trains was stupid, in his opinion, but she was the one with the diamond, so who was he to judge? He could deal with some blisters on his feet and aching legs if it meant getting his hands on a diamond that large. "In that case, we'll be on the road for a few days, most likely. That's assuming there's no rain, which, well, it's California, it hardly ever rains here." "Are you sure about that, traveler?" Az asked, looking up at the sky. "It seems very overcast today." "Trust me, we'll have to worry about the sun and the heat more than any rain," Alan answered. "But it won't be an issue, since there's plenty of spots along the way to rest and get some water." Both of them nodded along with his words. Alan took a breath. "All right, then. Los Baños it is." They spent most of the day walking, only stopping when the sun had started to set. They ended up setting up camp in the middle of a field, Alan putting up a small tent while Az set up a larger one for himself and Sable. As they worked, Alan couldn't help but note that neither of them were sweating at all. That made sense for Az, but Sable was clad in what had to be a pretty thick dress. It was a wonder she wasn't sweating bullets under the heat, despite how cloudy the skies were. He certainly was. Alan crawled into his tent, then pulled his boots off with a grunt and set them aside. He gave a small sigh of relief when he noticed his feet hadn't quite started to blister yet. They'd walked for around 7 hours, stopping intermittently for food and water, with few breaks in between those. Again, that made sense for an experienced outdoorsman such as himself, but he was surprised that his 2 traveling companions weren't having difficulties. Must be hardier than they look, he muttered to himself as he shrugged off his double barrel and set it aside. His Colt stayed on his hip, though he wasn't about to part with it just yet. Once he'd had a chance to relax a bit, Alan stood up and marched outside, planning to get a fire going. He was surprised to see that AZ had already started one, with small bits of tinder he'd found scattered around. Sable was sitting on a smooth rock a short ways away from the fire, leaning in to warm herself by it. Alan blinked in surprise, then moved closer, taking a seat across from the 2 of them. He wasn't much one for small talk, but with little else to do, his hand was forced. "So," he began. "What country are you 2 from?" "Romania," Sable answered. "Ah." He paused. "Where is that, exactly?" "Eastern Europe," AZ said. Alan nodded. "And what brings you both here?" "You're pretty far from home, all things considered." "Family troubles," was all Sable said. "My parents are no longer around, and my sister is being difficult. We both thought it best that I leave for greener pastures for a while." "Sorry to hear that," Alan offered. A thought occurred to him, and he sat up straighter. "You drink?" Az suddenly cleared his throat, and Sable paused. "No, not really." There was that weirdness again. Still, Alan was unperturbed. The diamond was a convincing argument, after all. "I've got some whiskey in my bag," he said. "We can share it if you both don't mind sipping from the same bottle." "Whiskey?" Az questioned. "What's that?" Again, Alan paused, though he soon caught himself. Maybe they simply didn't have whiskey in Romania or something. That'd be far from the weirdest thing he'd heard today. "Hang on, I'll be right back," he said. With that, he disappeared into his tent for a moment. When he returned, he was clutching a mostly full bottle of whiskey. He uncorked it and took a quick nip from it, letting out a sigh when he felt the pleasant warmth settle in his stomach. "You 2 want to try?" he said, offering them the bottle. "The only alcohol I drink is wine," Sable said dismissively. "Yeah, well, I don't have any of that. It's whiskey or nothing." "I will try," Az said. Alan nodded, then passed him the bottle. Az sniffed the liquor inside a bit, then before Alan could stop him, raised the bottle to his lips and took a deep sip. Alan expected him to be left a sputtering mess, but to his surprise, Arizona seemed perfectly fine. He simply lowered the bottle and wiped his lips with the back of a hand, then passed it back to him. "It is pleasant," was all Az had to say. Thanks," Alan said. He took a big sip of it himself to make sure it was actually as potent he remembered, and just about choked on it. Still, he recovered quickly, if only to save face in front of his traveling companions. "So, Alan," Az began, getting his attention. "Question for you." "Yes?" "If one wanted to learn more about the way this country is run, where would one go?" Alan brought a hand up to his chin in thought, then shrugged. "No idea. Library, maybe? Or perhaps a courthouse." "You're asking the wrong guy. Really, I never went to school anymore once I hit 13. I started working in the fields instead. I can read and write just fine, though, which is more than a lot of the other field hands I've worked with." "Quite," Sable said. She sniffed. "I can smell your alcohol from here. It smells vile." "Don't knock it till you've tried it," Alan said. He raised the glass to her, then took a swig from it. Safe to say that so far, he liked Az a lot better. "So, big man," Alan said, turning back to the giant. "You're her butler?" Indeed, AZ confirmed. How long ago did that start? A few weeks, I believe. Again, Alan paused. Seems pretty sudden. There a story there? Not much of one. And just like that, the conversation was dead again. These two certainly weren't much for small talk, it seemed. Maybe it was a Romanian thing. Alan was beginning to really dislike Romanians thanks to these two. Off in the distance, a coyote barked. Both Sable and AZ were on their feet in an instant, but Alan stayed where he was, drinking his whiskey. Relax, he said. It's just a coyote. How can you be sure? Sable demanded. Because I've encountered enough of them to know what they sound like, and that was definitely a coyote. If you don't know what that is. I know what a coyote is. All right. Wasn't sure if they had them in Romania. To be fair to him, they didn't seem to have a lot of things in Romania. Manners, for one. Anyway, it's no big deal, Alan assured them. If it gets too close to camp, I'll take care of it for you. He patted his single-action army revolver for good measure. Across from him, AZ's expression tightened. I was meaning to ask you about your weapons, he said. How do they work? What, you mean guns? Alan asked. It's complicated. A lot of chemical reactions, or something like that. All I know is I load the bullet into the gun, then I pull the trigger, and then whatever I'm aiming at dies, provided my aim is true. And these weapons are common in this country? Alan couldn't help but snort in amusement. Yeah, you could say that. Damn near everyone owns a gun. I own two, myself. Would own more, but I can't carry any more than these two around with me. Lots of guys who have their own homes and land own an entire arsenal. Rancher I used to work for had dozens of the things lying around. And those are just the ones in private hands. The entire military is armed with these things too. This country's military is powerful, then? AZ asked. Alan nodded. He wasn't sure why AZ was suddenly so interested in the capabilities of his weapons or the military, but considering this was the most conversation he'd gotten out of the two of them yet, he was inclined to answer, if only to stave off the boredom for a bit longer. This country's military is still pretty unproven, Alan answered. We just won our independence from Britain a little over 100 years ago. We've been getting established ever since then. I don't think we've fought a major war against an outside power yet. We did just get done fighting a pretty big one against ourselves, though. Against yourselves? Sable asked, suddenly interested in the conversation. Explain. Well, to make a long story short, the north and south parts of this country had a big disagreement over slavery and states' rights. The South seceded and the two parts went to war. It was pretty bloody, despite only lasting for a few years. But now the country's back together again. Sable gave a dismissive huff. To think that a leader would allow his country to split in such a way, intolerable weakness. Plenty of people here would agree with you, Alan offered. That guy's been out of control for some time now, though. I would avoid bringing it up if you go farther south, though wounds are still pretty fresh down there. A lot of guys won't appreciate being reminded of it. We'll keep that in mind, AZ said. Thank you. Alan simply nodded, then went back to drinking. The conversation died down after that, but that was fine. He was perfectly content to drink in peace for the time being. A few hours later, Alan came stumbling back into his tent, the empty whiskey bottle slipping from his grasp and falling to the ground, thankfully not breaking when it landed. He let out a tired groan, then collapsed onto his bedroll and shut his eyes, intending to get some sleep. But then, outside, he heard voices. Can't just do it like that. Not? You need to eat. Alan blinked, bringing a hand up to rub at his eyes. A heavy yawn escaped him, and his vision began to swim from a combination of the alcohol and his own exhaustion. Only been a few days since I last. He won't miss a pint or two. Not going to turn him. Won't if you're careful. Alan let out another yawn, then closed his eyes and rolled over onto his side. Whatever they were talking about, it didn't sound super important or like it involved him in any way. Even if it did, he was way too tired and drunk to worry about that at the moment. And so he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, confident that nothing would happen while he slept.